It's a bad moment. No one's denying that. And I don't think the UK is on the up and up. I think the UK, after a 300-year imperial adventure, which magnified its presence in the world, is simply going back to what it was before it began the imperial adventure, which is a reasonably influential European state off the northwest coast of Europe. I mean, that's what it is. So people should stop looking at Britain today through the lens of past empire. Those days are gone.
A US Apache helicopter is shot down near the Strait of Hormuz. Almost immediately, American forces strike back. French Mirage fighters in the UAE are scrambling into the sky, jumping to the defense of their Gulf partner. Suddenly, the Middle East's once again becoming an area where it's pulling the world's major powers back toward a very dangerous confrontation. And in the middle of all of this chaos, there is one question people keep asking. Where is the United Kingdom? A country that once dominated the Gulf, the United Kingdom now seems strangely absent from one of the world's biggest strategic flashpoints. Is this just a sign of changing times? Or is there something deeper going on here, like a decline in military power, political will, and strategic ambition? To help us unpack all of this, I'm joined today by Professor Julian Lindley-French, one of Europe's top strategic minds. So today, Julian and I are going to dig into a simple but pressing question. Is the United Kingdom still a serious power? Julian, welcome to the Focus podcast. It's a pleasure having you on.
John, good to see you, mate, and a pleasure to be with you, as always.
Julian, let's zoom out for a second. I mean, if you look at the big picture, do you think Western leaders are actually preparing for the future, or are they stuck in a sort of time loop and acting as though it's still the post-Cold War period?
You're in a debt loop, or what I would call a debt welfare loop, particularly the Western Europeans. The more west you get in Europe, the more unworldly they become. They just don't want to spend on defence. That's pure and simple, and we end up with this strange policies in many Western European countries of recognising only as much threat as their respective finance ministries think they can afford, which is not how defence works. You have to deal with the threat in front of you. But this strategic illiteracy, as I call it, is making not just Europe but the world more unstable. Willful weakness, which is what they've chosen to be, whatever the debt levels. You can't simply stop the world and get off, is leading to a situation where predators are being encouraged by such nonsense. These are, major powers: Germany, France, Britain, to a lesser extent, Poland and Italy. These are not insignificant powers even today. So when they become obsessed with domestic issues and effectively try to disengage from the world beyond, the world itself becomes more unstable because it encourages the autocrats. Simple as that.
Well, Julian, there is another thing that I've also noticed, and weirdly enough, you mentioned Italy, and I'm glad that you say that it is also a major power. But the fact of the matter is, it seems that Italy is now trying to get on top of its own pressing fossil fuel needs by, expanding its navy in order to protect convoys of fossil fuels from Libya into Italy. Surely, in a very indirect way, it appears that the Italians seem to have gotten with the program, even though it may not be a Europe-wide thing, it may not be a transatlantic thing, but at least for its own neck of the woods, they seem to be developing some form of military clout to look after themselves. That's obviously a good sign, right?
That's a good sign, and the Italian Navy is extremely good. People, for whatever reason, often underestimate the capacity of the Italian Navy. The problem is that it's been neglected for so many years. This will take time to fix.
Yes.
You don't conjure up platforms and systems overnight. And add to that the training, the drilling, the systems testing, the ship trials, everything else, you're talking years before I would consider that Europeans have an appropriate capability commensurate with their geoeconomic presence in the world. Declining though it may be, it is still very considerable. So, yeah, Italy's woken up to an extent. But will it go far enough? I doubt it. Because of politics internally in Italy, because of European politics, because of a tendency to believe the Americans at the end of the day will do it. And that is the big difference now, John. It's not just about Trump. Let's face it, Trump is a mercurial president. But he does reflect a fundamental reality, which is the rise of China is stretching American forces thin the world over, as you Australians know.
Yeah.
And unless we, the allies, step up and keep America strong where she needs to be strong, both in the Indo-Pacific and in the North Atlantic and Europe, then countries like Russia and most particularly China will simply force the Americans to look everywhere and anywhere and choose their moment when to act. And so Europeans really have a fundamental responsibility to help the US deal with this strategic challenge. Sadly, the political classes in most Western European countries, worst of all my own in Britain, are simply incapable of seeing it. These are people who have no understanding of geopolitics or geoeconomics, and frankly don't want to understand it, given the host of other challenges that they face.
Surely we have a bit of a problem here because I get it. I mean, yes, here in Australia, we're all concerned about China. But again, it's not a traditional threat. It's not like the Soviet Union was. We're trading with China. As a matter of fact, it's our number one trading partner. So the government is caught between wanting to appear to look tough against China when China appears to be pushing us, or at least, when the Chinese are pushing the Americans into the region, we want to be seen to be staunchly by our American allies. And yet also the Americans have a particular, or the Americans of today, I should say, have a very peculiar way of going about business themselves. I mean, they've let their armed forces, diminish. They're no longer what they once were. And I mean, if you're looking at their defense industries, for instance, once they were leading the pack, right? But now, I mean, if I go to the AUKUS submarine problem, right? So now the Albanese government here in Australia has said, well, you know what? We're going to get 3 second-hand Virginia-class submarines. And I say, bravo. But initially, I think that most people in the general public thought we were getting 3 brand new Virginia-class submarines. And then the government said, oh, no, 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 that wasn't the case. We were always going to get only 1 brand new Virginia and 2 second-hand ones. Now, whatever that case may be, the public perception was set that for the amount of money that we were putting in or handing over to the Americans to make the Virginia class deal happen, it's a movable feast. The headlines keep on coming up here in Australia. Is this on? Is it off? We don't know with Donald Trump in office whether or not we're going to be seeing a boat at all, but we've yet spent a few lazy $1 billion of Australian taxpayers' money on this. And dare I say, looking at our other AUKUS partner, the UK, well, their shipbuilding industry is in a parlous state, to say the least. I mean, you're having trouble keeping your own boats in the water, let alone thinking about laying down the keel for SSN AUKUS, if that ever comes about in the 2040s, 2050s, 2060s. So what does a small country like Australia do when its 2 big partners are dropping the ball on what we in Australia would consider a fundamental national security requirement? I mean, the Americans want us to be strong. We believe that we can only be strong with nuclear powered submarines. I don't know. Looks like a mess.
I'm going to push back on this, John. I mean, I'm the biggest critic of defence policy in the UK and a critic of often of US defence policy. But first of all, you never were going to get batch 4 Virginias. Partly because they have a crew of 130 and the Royal Australian Navy has a fundamental problem with crewing, the current Collins class. Now, as for SSN AUKUS, the capacity is there in the UK, as is the skill base. We're building the dreadnought class boomers right now in Barrow. We're building the last of the Astute class, which is the forerunner of SSN AUKUS. SSN AUKUS, when it is produced, will be a continuum using that yard. And it has a crew of 98 versus 130, which is much more in the requirement of the Royal Australian Navy, because the bottom line is, where else do you go? You need long-range, Pacific-relevant, nuclear-powered submarines that can endure and deploy over long periods and long distances, that are also able to take on the Chinese Type 095, which the only show in town is AUKUS. So I hear a lot of whinging coming out of Australia about this, but the reality is this will take some time. The reason for the Virginias is to give you some capability, which you'll get. There'll probably be batch 3s, even batch 2s, but mainly to give your Navy training on how to operate this kind of complex machine. These are some of the most complex machines ever built by human beings. So that, you need to work up to how to function with nuclear attack submarines. So I'm not that worried about SSN AUKUS. As for the Royal Navy and the Brits, right now is a low point, and I've criticised the current government in London critically. This week I've written a piece called "Critical Defence Theory," which
we're going to bring that up, Julian. We're going to bring that up. I read it.
Oh, that's great. Well, I'll leave that for the moment. But the bottom line is, we have Type 26s being built in Glasgow. We have Type 31s being built. We have the Astute class, which currently is undergoing a lot of maintenance because of various scheduling problems. We have the Type 45s being upgraded. The bottom line is that by 2028, 2029, the Royal Navy will be again by far Europe's most potent navy. By 2035, by far Europe's most potent navy. The problem is right now. And this week, government in London is grappling over the defence investment plan. And whilst those of us who understand these things recognise that we need 28 billion really to sort of fulfil the planning in the Strategic Defence Review. The Treasury, as always, because it's run by strategically illiterate economists. By the way, economists are the greatest threat to Western civilization that exist. This is a fundamental battle. But at some point, this government will be turfed out. And I'm absolutely convinced that Britain again will recapitalise. Why? Because the only way to pull the economy out of its slump is to use defence as a generator of economic growth. And Britain does have still a capable defence industry. Now, is that defence industry the classic industry of metal bashers, supply chains that are built around the steel industry? No, it's not. But look at how the 2 aircraft carriers were built. They were built by involving industries and companies that had never been involved in defence before, by exploiting the industrial and technological base and the supply chain to its full. The platforms are the easy bit. The systems, particularly the AI systems. Britain is the 3rd biggest AI economy in the world, has the 3rd biggest AI industry in the world. So it's not a question of a lack of capacity. It's a challenge with the political class, because they have a lack of political will, and at present seem to be obsessed with a host of other issues that are not grand strategic or structural or politically realist. And that is the crisis, frankly, that all our countries face, because we become too damn woke. We do not put our interests before our values, and we too often confuse our interests with our values. And that's not how the world works. The world is a competitive, often dangerous place. If you choose not to compete, you are being willfully weak, and you are destabilizing the system.
Okay, I've got to stop you there, because there's some real good meat that we can get stuck into. Now, of course, we're not all operating in political vacuums. I mean, sometimes it would be better if we were, but we're not. In the UK, you've got Nigel Farage, you've got the Reform Party. They seem to be doing pretty well in terms of, getting the public voice up there. But, here in Australia, we've got a similar kind of party called One Nation, led by a lady called Pauline Hanson. Now, the thing is, the West is changing from a political perspective. And I get what you're saying in terms of you're in a trough, you've got Keir Starmer, boring Keir, has no clue about what to do with defense, doesn't really care for it that much. And so he's quite happy to let things just bubble along, right? We've got a similar kind of government here with Anthony Albanese, believe me. But the fact is, we know what Keir Starmer kind of stands for. We may not agree with it, we may not like it. We may not agree with Anthony Albanese, we may not like it, but we know what we're getting. We don't know what we don't know when it comes to people like Nigel Farage and Pauline Hanson. Where do they stand on AUKUS? Where do they stand on the transatlantic alliance? Where do they stand on defense industry? The very thing that you've just said, and that is we need defense industry to help stimulate economic growth. Have they got any policies? I mean, I'll pass it to you with regard to with regard to Britain. Has Nigel Farage come out with anything substantive? Because I know Pauline Hanson has just released her magnificent policy, which is actually good to a point because I partially agree with it, the reintroduction of national service. But the way that she's proposing to go about it will bankrupt the country and will make a mess of defense. Now, you want to do something that grand, there you need to take the long view and phase it in over a period of time without breaking the system. But these new political figures that we're having to deal with, they just want to break the system. Go.
I disagree, John. What we need to do is to reschedule the debt or threaten the bond markets with a default and our debtors.
Okay.
No, seriously. I mean, once the strategic situation becomes too dangerous and then we have to act, there's no point in spending billions on servicing huge debt at the expense of our defenses. And in that situation, rather than say that an increased defense policy will bankrupt our respective countries, you turn that around, like happened in World War II. You go to your creditors and you say, "Look, this is a very dangerous moment. You benefit from peace. You can do business in peace. War will destroy everything that you do. Therefore, we're going to have to come to some kind of new lend-lease deal whereby we put public debt into a big box, we put it to one side, we agree to repay it over many, 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 many years at a very low interest rate, like we did with lend-lease to the Americans after World War II, because the fundamental strategic requirement is to maintain the peace." Now, as for Farage, the Overton window is shifting with Farage. Farage is presented as being some kind of neo-fascist. He's just a conservative, an old conservative. That's what he is. He has a view of patriotism built on defense, built on Britain having enough military capability to influence American policy, because the Americans are so central to Britain's own defense policy. He believes in NATO. He believes far more in these things than the Conservative parties under Cameron, Johnson, or Sunak, or indeed the Labour Party under Starmer. The sad thing is, I was born in Sheffield, in the north of England. I'm a Yorkshire lad. When I was born a few years ago, you could have put a bloody donkey up in the constituency in Sheffield Central where I was born, because it was a Labour seat. But the thing about that Labour seat would be it would be social democratic, the candidate. It would be pro-monarchy and patriotic. And there was no question of that. It might be Labour, but it was old Labour. It was patriotic, industrial, working class. That's gone. The new Labour Party is a kind of coalition of primary school teachers and left-wing university lecturers with their globalist and worldly policies. The far right, frankly, is small in the UK and equally ridiculous. But the failure of both the Conservatives and Labour to meet the needs of the British people in a changing world, including defence, means that parties like Reform, conservative, true conservative parties are actually moving ever more to centre stage of politics. Of course, the left-wing media will try to dismiss them as being far right, but they're not. Look at the people who've joined it recently: Suella Braverman, Robert Jenrick. I mean, these are just frankly conservatives. So what we're seeing is a shift in the Overton window of British politics caused by the failure of the British establishment and establishment parties, and that needs to be gripped by our allies and partners.
Okay, so you've got confidence that even if the Tories were to fold tomorrow and Farage takes the whole box and dice, Britain is still on the up and up. I mean, it'll be better than it was under Starmer or any of the other Tory forebears that came through in terms of putting forward a proper defence plan. Because I think that that's really what we need to hear if that's true. We need to hear it here in Australia because maybe that also means that the people that we've got here on the One Nation side of politics may be taking their lead from Reform and operating by the same playbook. So maybe we can say, okay, fair enough. We'll give these people a crack and see where they go. But again, being a sort of not a left wing, but being a former university lecturer, I think that I would like to see the meat and the sandwich before I put in, all my box and dice with these guys, right?
Bad news, mate.
Yeah. Okay, well, look, Julian, let's just bring it back to the Gulf for a moment. So this latest escalation that we're seeing, we've got American military power, which is on full display in the region, but the United Kingdom seems almost invisible in all of this. I mean, has the United Kingdom chosen to step back from these global responsibilities, or has it just lost the ability to play the game?
It's a bad moment. No one's denying that. And I don't think the UK is on the up and up. I think the UK, after a 300-year imperial adventure, which magnified its presence in the world, is simply going back to what it was before it began the imperial adventure, which is a reasonably influential European state off the northwest coast of Europe. I mean, that's what it is. So people should stop looking at Britain today through the lens of past empire. Those days are gone. But what Britain is a country that retains an outstanding intelligence service, which does a huge amount of work behind the scenes, which no one ever sees because that's the nature of the business. I was in a meeting in Brussels before Brexit, and I was no great fan of Brexit, but I had a European Commission official tell me in this meeting that if Brexit was happened, Britain would be denied access to intelligence, and me and my colleague just burst out laughing because some 75% of all the raw intel they got was from the Brits. That's just the reality of it. And we really add value to both the US UK relationship in intelligence and of course Five Eyes. So Britain is doing an awful lot. It has several instruments of power still, not just the military. The problem is it's the military instrument of power that's been really weakened, not just since Starmer came to power, but by the Conservatives since 2010 and by the American-created banking crisis. People forget that. It was the Americans, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and their toxic loans, who bankrupted European states so much that we had to pour billions of taxpayers' money that should have gone to defense into keeping the banks afloat.
But you don't
This
hear
was an
that from.
American-inflicted crisis.
Oh, sorry, Julian. But you don't hear the Americans say it like that. I mean, I wish they would, because it would give us a great dose of honesty from their side. Because they just
Well,
look
it's
at the
like they
rest of it.
won.
Say
Yeah,
again?
it's like they won World War II. I mean,
Yeah.
the Americans don't ever accept liability.
They
They
don't, do
don't
they? Yeah.
ever accept that they did things bad to their allies,
Yeah.
or that their allies did good things for them. I mean, that's just the American way. I love them. I'm a great believer in the
So do
United
I.
States.
Absolutely.
I do find this kind of, Trump lecturing Europeans about not spending enough on defense when it was the bloody Yanks who actually caused this problem in the first place.
Yeah.
It was the crash of the banking system that led to the 2010 Strategic Defence and Security Review in the UK, which saw a 10% cut in the British Armed Forces in the middle of a major campaign in Afghanistan. I mean, this was unheard of. And what really, the real problem the British Armed Forces face is that the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Finance Minister George Osborne, transferred the cost of the nuclear deterrent, which had traditionally been paid for outside the defence budget, into the defence budget. And the result is, ever since, we've not had enough money to create a nuclear deterrent worthy of the name, or a conventional force able to do its basic missions. And that's the thing that has to be solved. And I think it will be. And certainly someone like Farage would move to solve it. But we're moving to a point, John, where countries like our own face a fundamental choice. Unless the financial system begins to support us in maintaining peace, then at some point we ourselves might have to radically reconceive how that financial system works. There's no point in simply having a financial system that only serves China in the end of the day, at our own expense. It's this, frankly, unwillingness, this lack of will to be strategically radical, which I believe is the greatest danger that Western powers have in ensuring the peace in a contested world.
Oh, look, Julian, that's just gold. I mean, I agree with everything that you've said. And I'll just add a couple of points on the last point that you've raised, and that is the way that we construct our finances. One of the other own goals that the West managed to do quite successfully, and it enriched a lot of people. So I suppose those people who benefit the most from it will see no problem with the system as it's currently constructed, and that is neoliberal economics. That is just in time. That is this fragile, globalized, woke, whatever you want to call it, world that everyone kept on convincing us, the poor people out there, that this is going to be good for us. It's going to be brilliant. Just wait, it's going to be brilliant. But then you've got companies that only look after their bottom line. You've got companies that look after shareholders. They don't look at the strategic big picture. I mean, you've got now even defense companies, Lockheed Martin, huge giant in the United States. But where is its moral point? Where is its point where, yes, they're not just a company, but they're looking after the West, or they're looking after the United States, if we want to get a little bit more specific? You don't see that. It's just a company. And when we don't have that ability to separate making money from defending what is our life and livelihood, I think there's a problem there. So maybe neoliberalism, I'm not a socialist, I'm not a communist, I'm not a social democrat, but I like capitalism. But you know what? I always say to my friends when they push me on, and I've got a lot of left-wing friends, but I say, listen, people, I like the Australia that was in the 1960s and 70s from an economic perspective, because we had what they called a mixed economy. You had your mom and pop business, corner shop, delicatessen, whatever. You could, have your big players. You had a sort of balance between the three classes. You had government that had government-run airlines that were actually running in the black Qantas. That used to be the people's airline, and it was run properly. You had before Telstra, Telecom, another big government telco, and that was run properly. And so the people got a dividend from the profitability of these two companies. So I say, if you had a mixed economy, bring back what's important to people rather than what's important and profitable for shareholders, perhaps the political dynamic between the economic and the political would stabilize into something that would be better for the country. I don't know. I'm just putting it out there.
John, get over it, mate. I mean, the 1960s is not the 2020s. Look at what the 1960s was a kind of hangover from the post-war, post-imperial era. Britain was still the second biggest economy in the world at the time, often underpinning a lot of the Australian economy, by the way.
Oh, no, yeah. Sure.
Before Britain betrayed you and joined the EEC,
Never forgave you for that.
73.
Yeah.
So I think we after all when I think of what Australians did for peace in Europe and elsewhere, in the 20th century. That was a betrayal. We owed it to you. But I grew up partly in that kind of mixed economy Britain. But I'm glad to hear that Telstra and other great companies in Australian history were running wonderfully well. Nationalisation didn't work well in Britain. The kind of post-war Attlee settlement, whereby the railways, the GP, the General Post Office, all that kind of British railways, they were strike-ridden disasters that were costing the public ever more. And as relative decline set in, there always had to be a radical economic reset. And of course, that came in Britain in the form of Thatcher. Now, I agree with you. I don't particularly like the kind of Milton Friedman trickle-down economics. But my God, did Britain need a kick up the backside after what was happening in the I grew up in the 70s. The strikes and if you think things are bad now, look at the 1970s. Oh, yeah. The music was great, but the economy was crap. and that was the reality. So, I mean, what do you want? I mean, I think we suffer from a perfect world syndrome, whereby we all look back on the past with nostalgia, and it wasn't as good as we think it was. At the same time, we say, look, the current economy doesn't work well. Well, what do you want? Communism? Fascism? Do you want a command economy? This is as good as it gets, mate. In a competitive world where other powers are emerging, where we're becoming relatively poorer, government has to lead us through that complexity and explain to its people the realities of the world we live in and the geo-economic and geopolitical consequences.
But they're not good at doing that, Julian.
The numpties who tend to run our countries, and they are. I mean, I was at Oxford with much of the political class. All right, so not this generation, but the last generation. I wouldn't trust these bloody people with a Morris Minor, let alone my country. I knew them as undergraduates.
Oh dear God.
Some of them had far too much ambition and far too little intellect, and so that is the world we live in. Those are the people we elect, because ordinary people don't go into politics. And to some extent, we have to own that reality ourselves, because we've inflicted it on ourselves.
Yeah. Okay, so Julian, let's go on to some more optimistic, hopefully. Well, I don't know, optimistic maybe.
I'm a Yorkshireman lad. We don't do optimistic.
Oh, yeah. I'm an Adelaide lad. We try. Right, look, the UK just finished another strategic defence review, Julian. So do we finally have a defence strategy that matches the ambitions of the UK, or are we still trying too much with too little?
A bit of a disclaimer here. I know George Robertson, Lord Robertson. I've known him for many years. It's a good plan, and it's a realistic plan. And I think it's a reasonable attempt by good people to balance the ends, ways, and means of defence. The money it is demanding to fulfill the plan is not money that should frighten a state with a $3 trillion economy. It really is achievable if it were not for this kind of post-COVID welfare explosion that is, basically, Britain is a welfare budget with a state attached these days. We have to change that fundamentally because we just can't go on being this uncompetitive in a highly competitive world. And the Strategic Defence Review, what it does is it looks at Britain as it is today, its society, its size, its strengths, its weaknesses, its industries, its supply chains. Look, Britain is a population of 70 or so million reasonably educated, highly networked individuals in a small space that can be generated into a very considerable power if it is properly led. Russia always tries to claim it's a great power because look at a map. Russia's size is its curse, and Australia to some extent, your size is your curse. For us, we haven't got that problem. The problem is we're just not well led. And that's the great lacuna in strategy. When I wrote that book above me with Field Marshal Lord Richards, The Retreat from Strategy, which, by the way, is coming out in paperback in September, updated, and is brilliant and very reasonably priced. When we
we
wrote
will
it,
advertise that in our show notes, by the way, Julian. So
you are a
only for
major
a mere
contribution.
10%. Mere 10%.
You are a major contribution to road safety, me old mate. I can tell you. But in the book, we just laid out the plan for not for the Britain of the past, but the Britain of today to play. And frankly, AUKUS is part of that. And AUKUS makes perfect sense because you Aussies might be rubbish at cricket, but you're still family. We still love you, and this conversation we're having, we understand each other. We understand the Americans. We understand the Canadians.
Yeah.
When I went to Afghanistan, I was in Regional Command South and in Kandahar. The one thing I noticed about the people who went to do the heavy lifting, the militaries that did the heavy lifting, by and large, they all spoke English.
Yes.
When it came to the crunch, we know we will be there for each other still. And that is why, whatever the tactical tensions and difficulties that are inevitably associated with very complex projects, at the end of the day, we will see it through for each other. I was speaking to Tony Radakin, in many ways one of the architects of AUKUS and someone I've known for many years and former chief of the British Defence Staff. And Tony, was saying that, well, the Australians came to us to ask about AUKUS. We didn't come up with it, but it was the right deal. And I upset the French and I upset the French big time, which is frankly not something that I find particularly difficult, because I pointed out that the submarines that they were sending to you were crap. The attack Barracudas would not have served your need going out beyond 2035, 2040. And that's the game we're in. I'm just finishing off a new book with Generals John Allen, US Marine Corps, General Ben Hodges, and General Mick Ryan, formerly of the Australian Army and of your parish. It's called Future War in the Pacific. And when I was researching this book, I was looking into the growth of the PLA, not just the size of it, but the nature of it. And it clearly is a very aggressive force built around a growing Han Chinese nationalism led by President Xi, who believes that China has been wronged and this is China's time, on top of a very unstable economy and a dangerously unstable society. Now, these are all the recipes for danger. So, like it or not, China might be your biggest trading partner, but it's also your biggest adversary. Increasingly, it's our biggest adversary as well. Therefore, if we are to preserve the peace and manage China's ambitions to a point where they accept coexistence, peaceful coexistence, soft power is frankly irrelevant. There is no soft power unless it is supported by hard power. Soft power without hard power is no power. As Thomas Hobbes famously said, covenants without the sword are words and of no use to any man. Well, when dealing with China, and I was based in Hong Kong in the early 80s, that is the reality. Not because we want war, but because we want peace. We want to support America to maintain a balance. We want to support work with Japan and other like-minded countries to preserve the peace. Because countries like China, as an Oxford historian, I can say this, the evidence is very clear, that when countries emerge very quickly from a deep slough in their power and their place in the world, they often emerge angry. One thinks of Imperial Germany and what that led to in Europe. And China, I think, is in a similar place. There's an anger to China's worldview that, whilst managed by a superb diplomacy, and they are very impressive, nevertheless it's underpinned by this anger. At some point, China needs to become a responsible partner for itself and for us and everybody else, because at the moment, its anger is driving it to break a whole host of rules, whether it's trading rules, whether it's access to the Chinese market for other companies, whether it's industrial levels of espionage on our companies, our universities, and our states, it is not behaving like a responsible actor. And when you're faced with that reality, history tells us you only counter it by confronting it, but using statecraft to confront it in a sophisticated, engaging way, not just hurling threats backwards and forwards, which is frankly the mistake I think that Trump often makes.
I was going to say, because, Trump and Xi had recently met, and, it looked as though, and look, the televisuals were pretty bloody awful, I will say. Trump is all full of bombast and thumps his chest wherever he can and belittles the Europeans at every opportunity and every turn. But when it came to his mate, Xi, he was humble. He had his hands between his knees. He was hunched over, almost supplicating to the great man. This was not the kind of image that we in the West would need from the number one political leader in the West, namely the US president. The US president should have met him, stared him straight in the eye, shoulders back. This is the American position, and you will not cross X, Y, and Z. Not go there like a limp dog. I mean, I thought it was just horrible. And, as an Australian at the sort of bleeding edge of all this stuff, I'm kind of thinking this is setting all the wrong signals. And it's also putting Australia in a bit of a bind as well, because, China does think that we're the West's soft underbelly. Why do you think they probed the Australian coastline not that long ago? With their small flotilla. It was a small flotilla by any standard, but against the Royal Australian Navy and how many ships we have, it was something to worry about. And there we go. We've got now that lack of diplomacy. You talk about diplomacy and statecraft, I'm 100% with you. But again, Julian, we're not in the 19th century. You can't pull out an Israeli or a Metternich or someone that has some understanding of geopolitics. You're pulling out people like Trump. And people like Trump barely read, let alone look at caricatures of themselves on TV. So I don't know. There's a lack of sophistication. And it's not just the Americans. It's easy to beat up on Trump. So for our American audience, we're not beating up on Trump. Well, maybe not that much. But there is a general malaise in terms of Western diplomacy. I mean, again, Britain, from a Western perspective, used to have these titanic figures who knew everything. And now, what have you got? I mean, I don't, honestly, hand on heart, Julian, I don't even know who your foreign minister is, quite frankly. I mean, it's that spectacular. Can you please tell the audience? I don't think.
Well, she's called Yvette Cooper, and she knows nothing about foreign policy. But that's all right, because most of our foreign secretaries never know anything about foreign policy. So that's perfectly useful. Look, I mean, first of all, we've got to stop whinging. Trump is not the leader of the West. He's the leader of the United States. Like it or not, he's the leader of the United States. He has an America First policy. Stop looking to the Yanks to solve everything. We've got to start solving things ourselves a bit. By adding value to those relationships. We've become so bloody complacent, so, as I've said, strategically illiterate, so self-delusional about power in this world, that we've created the opportunities for this. And the Americans are right. We've been free riding on the Yanks for decades, because they were so powerful. Now, partly it's the Americans' own fault, because they do like to be in charge. I remember I was at a major conference in the Pentagon with the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton at the time was there, Secretary of Defence Gates, the NATO Secretary General Rasmussen was there, and it's about 2010, about the strategic concept. And I was chairing a panel, and it was just after a coffee session. There's about 1,000 very senior people in the room, and the Pentagon coffee. They might have the best armed forces in the world, but they have the worst coffee in the world. And I said to them when I opened my session, I said, look, Yanks, we Europeans will do you a deal. We will improve our armed forces if you improve your coffee. And there was a kind of message in that, which is we all have our strengths. If we play this in terms of not simply focus on establishing power in relation to the US armed forces alone, but rather looking at the instruments, all the instruments of power, including the military, that we all need in our shared interests to maintain the peace in our interests. If we do that, we can develop armed forces which won't be the same as the Americans. They'll be different, but they'll still be capable of underpinning all other instruments of power, diplomacy, economic security. It just needs some creativity, John. And what drives me mad, having been, a kind of observer of all this for so many years and close to it on so many occasions, is the lack of creativity of our establishments. They say, this system of defense doesn't work, therefore it's over. No, adapt, adjust. The Americans are going through a period of nationalistic self realignment. I remember watching recently the series Masters of the Air about the bombing campaign over Europe. I called it Masters of Hot Air.
Yeah.
Masters of Hot Air, because you think the RAF never took part. I mean, they're going through a nationalist.
What?
Yeah, well, but which had a lot of Australians on board, I might add.
Oh no, exactly right.
It was an imperial Commonwealth effort, a huge effort, which was frankly bigger than the United States Air Force effort, and ironically much more precise in many occasions. All the great precision attacks of World War II were carried out by Bomber Command, not by the United States Army Air Force. And yet the narrative is that the Yanks came and saved us. Now, they've got themselves lost in this right now, and Trump is a product of that, almost self-pity. At some point, they're going to realize that not only are allies useful, that as the relative power of the United States relatively and modestly declines, they need us. And it might behove them to be a bit more polite when dealing with us, or particularly when it comes to stealing our history. There's what I call the U-571 syndrome, where, the US Navy rescues the Enigma machine from a sinking submarine. And right at the end of the movie, it says, in 1941, HMS Bulldog, blah, 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 rescued the Enigma machine from the sinking U-110. I mean, that's where America's at right now. So let's stop whinging about it. It will change, because there are a lot of good people in the US who know how important those relationships are. And I can tell you this, for all Trump's bluster, they will never let us fail, particularly the Australians and the Brits, because we are family. Deep down, we are still family. And that goes much deeper than people give it credit for. Now, China, Trump's visit, yeah, you're right. Xi set out to humiliate Trump. His language, the way the visit was managed by the Chinese media, he set out to humiliate Trump for a domestic audience and for China's burgeoning audience around the world. And when it came to Taiwan, he simply stated the reality. The United States will never go to war with China over Taiwan. That's the strategic reality. But something was said by Trump during that visit, was by and large, to paraphrase it, okay, let's find a peaceful way to reunite Taiwan with mainland over the coming decades. But don't for a minute think that we will turn away if you try to challenge the United States elsewhere in the world. And that was the message that Xi took. And the choice that Xi now faces is this. Do they simply focus on regaining, of re-establishing Taiwan within the bosom of the People's Republic of China? Or are they engaged in a much more ambitious strategic objective of replacing the United States in its place as the leading actor in the world? If they try that, they'll fail. They will fail catastrophically, because the Chinese have no experience of major systemic power projection. And that is something that we in the West tend to forget. Look at even militarily, look at the distance from the mainland to Taiwan, about the same as the distance from Portsmouth to the Normandy beaches in 1944. By the time we did Normandy, We'd done Operation Torch, we'd done Salerno, we'd done Anzio. We'd learned how to do these complex combined maritime amphibious operations, and we had complete air superiority and complete naval dominance. Operation Neptune. By the way, D-Day was 70% British. More British and Canadian troops landed on D-Day than Americans. 70% of the ships were British. This was primarily a British operation, and we did it. And the Chinese have never done anything like it, and they'd have to cross the Straits of Taiwan in a contested sea. So for all the bluster of Xi, they're not that stupid. So the deal is this: they get to a peaceful, whatever you call it, a rejoining of Taiwan to the People's Republic over time. But China must not challenge the West in the wider world in an aggressive way. By all means, be a partner, be a trading partner, be an economic partner, be a humanitarian partner, but do not challenge the West in terms of fundamental strategic power, because if it does that, it will fail.
And look, I agree. I think that one thing that hasn't been said a lot and it should be mentioned, and that is modern China today. Yes, it's got a spectacularly large armed force. Yes, it's got, it's churning out warships like sausages. And yes, the army is terrifyingly large by Western standards. But all of this is underpinned by an economy that has deep uncertainties. I mean, the only thing keeping Xi Jinping looking strong at this point in time is that he did not cook off, a third of his ballistic missiles or drones on a useless war, which then leads me to the next thing. Relatively speaking, right now, there would be some people in the Pentagon, I would dare guess, that would be a bit worried that if China, having kept its military powder dry, is all of a sudden looking rather strong in the Indo-Pacific East Asia theater, whereas the United States, who have gotten themselves involved, and look, I don't know about what you think about that Iran war, but I thought it was a pretty useless enterprise. I mean, there were other ways in which you could have contained the Iranian threat. The Iranians, I don't know what it is about the United States culture, I suppose. But every time they look at a threat, they look at it through a World War II style lens, that it's some sort of Nazi threat, and they overdo the threat. And the Iranians were never that. They were threatening, to be sure, and they're not good guys by any stretch. If they fell tomorrow, I'd be breaking open the champagne. But at the end of the day, they are not an existential threat. They did not require this war to be taught a lesson, because ultimately the only lesson that's being taught is that Iran now owns the Strait of Hormuz, and that the blockade of the blockade isn't kind of working the way that Donald Trump and his acolytes have envisaged. So there is a likelihood, getting back to the China-Taiwan thing, that, well, okay, let the Americans challenge us over Taiwan. I mean, and here we can posit a scenario. It's a well-known one, that the Chinese would start kicking off not by kicking off, but by using its fleet of fishing vessels in aggressive manners, or Coast Guard vessels. They wouldn't put their top-of-the-line ships anywhere close to Taiwan, because they would know that there's a good likelihood of some of them sinking. And in the opening phases of any campaign, that would not look good for Xi, because again, he is a dictator, and his dictatorial prowess, or him being the cherry on the icing of the CCP, is there because he's a steady hand. It's not because he's throwing caution to the wind and saying, I'm declaring war and I'm taking over Hawaii. It's not that at all. And you're absolutely right. When you talk about China, where is the practice in war and force projection that they've had? The last war that they have had was in 1979 against Vietnam, which had just unified and been successful in ousting the Americans. So they didn't fare too well back then. And for all the shiny brand new missiles and drones and everything else that the media keep on throwing at us, the ultimate question for China from a military standpoint is it all glitz? Is it all for parade? Or does it actually work as some of the PLA commanders would like to think it works? Big question.
I mean, the Eastern Theater Command, which would be responsible for any invasion of Taiwan, actually is pretty good. It's since the purges, it's been staffed by younger officers who, really are quite impressive. But but it's not there to do that. What is the reason that the military exists in the way it does is so that there is this mailed fist behind the soft power that China's going to use on Taiwan. I mean, look at the Kuomintang. They ultimately want reunification with China. Taiwan is politically very divided. That's going to be the focus of Chinese operations, with the threat of invasion, the kind of mailed fist that if you don't move towards this, if this could happen. It's they're not stupid. In fact, they're very sophisticated. So that's my sense of what the PLA is for, and also because if you think back to the unequal treaties of the 1840s, they have been humiliated by the West, and the Han Chinese, which make up over 90% of the population, they want to feel proud of their country, and their military helps them feel proud of their country. That this is the Middle Kingdom, or all under the heavens that we rule, kind of stuff. We all go through it. We've all had it. We've all had our periods. This is China's period for having that. But it needs to be managed. And the danger is twofold. One is, having built this military, any military then always immediately starts to become obsolescent. The moment it's built, it becomes increasingly obsolescent. So unless they're going to have the economic capacity to completely rebuild it and rebuild it and rebuild it, you end up risking losing it if you don't use it. Second, Xi is president for life. He's becoming increasingly detached from reality, as all these presidents do. He's a man on a mission. I think because of what the Americans have done in Iran, let's face it, the Americans, Trump just jumped at a Mossad report he presented in the Oval Office, and the Israelis suckered him into this, and many Americans to whom I've spoken in senior positions have confirmed this. There is a window of danger that between now and say 2031, where if pushed, if the domestic situation of Xi, if the so-called post-Tiananmen contract, whereby the Chinese middle classes agree the CCP can maintain power in return for becoming ever more wealthy, if that collapses, and the CCP, which is is basically control freakery on steroids, if its position is threatened, then you might see the kind of adventurism in Taiwan as a desperate move to shore up domestic power. But the ideal solution, and this is what Trump was basically implying, was that we can work with you on Taiwan. Just don't challenge us in the wider world. And I think there's a deal there, because ultimately China's wealth and power has been built on the West.
Oh, yes.
It's been built on our, what I would call, consumer obesity, driven by huge corporations like Amazon, where I'm a golfer, and I often buy lots of things for my when I play golf. Well, I say I'm a golfer. I'm a pretty awful golfer, but I love it. So much of the stuff I buy is made in China. I mean, that's what built China's wealth.
Yes.
Now, if they're cut off from the West, whilst other economies are emerging, it's going to be a long time before that kind of source of indirect investment could be regenerated by China. So that there is, whilst there's no real ideological confrontation or conflict with China, there is actually an opportunity, if it's managed properly, for peaceful coexistence built around mutual enrichment. But as long as nationalism is stalking the Great Hall of Beijing, then there's always a danger of war as well, because that's what nationalists do when they're put in a corner.
And also, just to re-emphasize the point, the fact that we don't have the statesmen in any part of the world that can really manage these big, complicated relationships, as we once had other big, complicated relationships being managed by statesmen. And the rise of the right is, it's in the West, it's in China, it's in Japan. I mean, it's an international phenomenon. Let's be serious about this.
Yeah, because settled establishments need a good kicking. They just do. They've failed.
Look, Julian, this conversation is brilliant, but I had a whole bunch of questions that I had to ask you. But we're going on segues all over the place.
Notorious for this, John.
Oh, well, we are. But the thing is that it's such an awesome conversation to have, because you bring that sort of I like to call it the old worldliness and the wisdom back into the system. And I thank you for that. And I'm sure that our audience thanks you for that too. But you mentioned earlier, and I want to get back on track a little bit before we go on to another segue, and that is your recent article on critical defense theory. It appears that your argument says that the United Kingdom's defense weakness is no longer simply a consequence of poor budgeting and strategic mistakes, but it's increasingly a consequence of ideology. Have we reached a point where the United Kingdom's defense weakness is no longer accidental but political? And if so, what exactly is the United Kingdom choosing when it chooses weakness?
It's choosing to hide behind its nuclear deterrent
Ah,
and
good.
withdraw its conventional forces from Europe and elsewhere, and use its intelligence services to forewarn of any potential attack, knowing full well that Britain itself is unlikely to be attacked. I mean, and if it is attacked, it'll be a spectacular but not existential attack. So, if you're sitting in London and you've got a host of other problems, there is this reality which, who's going to attack us? We're a nuclear armed island with huge destructive power at the under the behest of the Prime Minister, under control of the Prime Minister. So there is a kind of selfish logic to this, which I completely reject, because we're a leading power in NATO. I mean, when I saw in the Times this week that NATO has now ranked the British Armed Forces as the 31st out of 32nd in terms of their readiness. The British Armed Forces are 31st out of 32 allies in terms of their readiness for war. And the only one behind it is Iceland, which has no armed forces. I mean, what an indictment. I mean, I was at the London Defence Conference, and the Secretary of State for Defence was John Healey was there, and I spoke immediately after him. And what he said was complete and utter bloody nonsense. And I said so in these terms. I said, what you just heard, ladies and gentlemen, is complete and utter crap. The British Armed Forces, in their current state, could just about take a small market town in Leicestershire with a bit of help. But that's about it. They are in a mess. And politicians have got to stop pretending otherwise. Now, the reason I wrote that article called Critical Defence Theory was because I look at some of the people in government. The current British government is basically student union politics that's got out of control. And what they are young, perfectly decent. Their worldview has been shaped by the last 20 years. And if you're young in Britain in the last 20 years, you haven't had it easy because, it's been a tough time. But it's become increasingly unworldly, taught by universities, which have also become increasingly unworldly. So I linked, controversially and deliberately so, critical race theory and diversity, equity, not equality, and inclusion, which is causing so much controversy in Britain as we speak because of recent cases which I won't go into, to what I call critical defense theory, which is a belief by an establishment that is increasingly politicized to the left, which believes that weakness is virtue. We saw it with the Chagos Islands, ridiculous deal. Weakness is virtue. Why? Because Britain is guilty of empire, of all the crimes of empire, including genocide. And therefore, anybody who is attacking Britain probably has due cause, because at some point Britain was terrible to them. This is dangerous nonsense. This is going from one extreme of the history I was taught at school, which was the narrative of British heroes, the Nelsons, the Wellingtons, the Churchills of this world, which tended to exaggerate Britain's role in the world, and particularly its role in world wars, important though it was, to another extreme, which now says Britain is not only irrelevant, but it is necessarily irrelevant because it is guilty of past crimes. That is why I linked critical race theory to critical defense theory. And therefore, the choices that Britain is making for defence are driven by a sense that Britain doesn't have the right to defend itself or its people. And the central point to my article was this, that implicit in what's happening in Britain, and two-tier policing is a fact, it's just an evident fact in Britain today. If a government and an establishment are not prepared to secure their citizens from crime, then it's a short step to that same establishment not being willing to defend the country either. And that is where I fear we're going. And the response to that article, which, as I said, was deliberately provocative, has been amazing. Very, very senior people, who I will obviously not name, have said, thank you for writing that. Thank you for putting that out there, because there is a kind of ideological element in all this. And when I look at Australia, I think you may be suffering from a similar phenomenon there.
Yes. Yes.
And by the way, I think the One Nation lot are a consequence of that. They're a reaction to it. It's not like the Australian population has suddenly all become right-wing. It's just fed up with not being listened to. It's fed up with elites lecturing them and not delivering, promising them and not delivering. The same in Britain. And until we get back to common sense, if I was, and I'm a Yorkshireman, Yorkshire people should be in charge of everything, because we're brought up to be commonsensical. We're grounded in reality, and if Geoffrey Boycott for president would be my great mantra.
I never thought of it, but okay, yep, sure. Okay, so
it's all about the corridor of uncertainty, John, just outside the off stump.
All right. I knew it would have to come back down to cricket at some point. Look, Julian, I mean, you raised such a deep point here about the critical defence theory. My question to you is, do you think that UK leaders actually believe that their country is worth defending? If they're wearing the black arm view of history, if they're so deeply ashamed of the centuries of Britain's titanic empire, and there's nothing to be proud of, and they're educating the children that there is nothing to be proud of. All you have to do is, if you have a white skin color, be ashamed of yourself. I mean, yes, I see that there is an enormous pushback against this kind of thinking. That's what, I mean, people say, well, why did Trump rise to power? It was because of this kind of thinking in the United States. Same goes for in Britain, same goes for in France with the National Front, Giorgia Meloni in Italy. There is this general consensus that the political elites have just disconnected themselves. They're all right, mate. They've got their money coming in from their various Wall Street mates or wherever, the various other capitals get their money from. They're okay. They can afford to lecture. They can afford to tell us how we should be thinking, correct thinking, just like in the Orwell book 1984. And we're all just meant to be the saps sitting back going, thank you very much, oh masterful one. You know exactly what we need to think and do. Sadly, or at least thankfully, from our perspective, at least from a common sense perspective, people are not like that. And yes, we are pushing back. My only fear in all of this, and I'm not sure if you share it, is that just like the people who were very pro-Trump and pro-MAGA, or even were just wanting to vote for Trump because they were sick of the system and they thought that the system needed a shake, they all got very, very disappointed when the reality of Trump being president, got put before them. And I'm sure that a similar kind of phenomenon will happen if and when Nigel Farage becomes prime minister, if and when Pauline Hanson becomes prime minister. Yes, there'll be that rush of blood to our head. Yes, we got rid of the bastards, and now we're saddled with a different form of bastard who may or may not also leave us with a very bad taste in our mouths collectively. So I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, but the expectations in Britain of their political class is now so low that any change along the direction that Farage is suggesting will probably be welcomed by the majority of the people. That is the reality. They're not expecting him to change the country overnight. And like the supporters of Trump, there'll be huge numbers of idiots Trump wasn't elected by the people of America to 2 terms in the presidential office on the basis of a bunch of right-wing nutters. It was a coalition involving huge numbers of centrists, as the system in Britain works as well. I mean, people are just so frustrated that they elect people like this because things need to be done and the establishment is not doing it. And that's the bottom line. I have a theory as to what are the problems of this. Years ago I worked for the EU, and I saw up close how European elites would tend to talk to each other but not to the people. And one of the reasons why the British elite was so anti-Brexit was because they'd be forced to speak to the people directly rather than being able to use Europe as an excuse, the EU not to do things, but also to lose that presence in the whole European construct, that elite presence. It disturbed me then, even though I was pro-EU. It disturbed me then because we seem to be moving towards a globalist, technocratic, elite-led approach at the expense of democracy. And I've often tried to explain Brexit to my European colleagues. In fact, I was the very first. I remember sitting at a dinner in 2011 with a very senior German, a very senior Dutch, and a very senior Frenchman. And I said, Britain will leave the EU. And the Frenchman and the Dutchman laughed. The German, who is a good guy, I won't name him for obvious reasons, very close to Merkel, said, tell me more, Julian. And I did. And then the day after Brexit, which I hadn't supported because I thought it was bad geopolitics, a bottle of champagne arrived from him as a thank you, because I'd flagged that this was a possibility because I knew my country. Now, why did I know it was my country? The English Civil War, English political culture is built on the Civil War, as is the American Revolution. And its fundamental tenet is it does not like distant, unaccountable power. That power must be kept close to the people. The Australian Constitution is based on a similar principle. And huge numbers of British people were not being xenophobic. They didn't like the transfer of sovereignty and powers to a effective supranational institution in Brussels, which took power ever further distant from them.
Yes.
And that goes to the heart of English, American, Australian, Anglo political culture. And it was that drove me to say, there's a crisis coming. Now, that English political culture, that stubborn, bloody-minded culture, which we've given you, which, is an American culture, it's all part of our shared identity, it's still there. And what's happening now, that the English in particular, and let's be blunt, the English are the only ones that really have power in the British Isles because we're over 90% of the population and over 90% of the economy. Say Scotland got independence, well, it'd still be tied to England by reality. So exactly. That's the reality of it. So the bottom line is this: the English are now waking up. They've had enough. And they're saying to their leaders, you sort this or there's going to be trouble. I don't condone the violence we've seen over the last 24, 48 hours. I think it's actually getting in the way of solutions. But if the political class does not seek to address the fundamental concerns of common sense Britain, these problems will grow and grow and grow. As for Farage, the pendulum, these things go in cycles as well. But people in Britain are not expecting huge things of their next government. They think, to be blunt, and I hope I can use this language on your podcast, they think all politicians are wankers. Yes, but what they want is at least someone who starts applying common sense to power in my country.
Julian, how would you describe the UK's broad national culture? I suppose it's now becoming a settler culture, like Australia always has been, but now you're getting a big dose of it. And for many a year prior to the waves of immigrants who have come in from the 1950s onwards, which is obviously having its moment of changing the direction and composition of British society. How does the average Briton see themselves now?
I worry about this, John. I think it's exaggerated. I think that there's still about an 80% of the population is white British. And the massive majority of immigrants who have come in are perfectly decent people and add value. We have a particular problem caused by stupid policy of allowing significant numbers of young men of fighting age into our country through illegal migration without even knowing who they are.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It's just this week the counterterrorism czar of the government has actually said illegal immigration is a national security threat for the first time. The Starmer government doesn't want to hear it because they're full of international rights lawyers like Lord Hermer, who is one of those who doesn't believe in Britain. But I do think that old gits like me, I'm in my late 60s. It's not my Britain anymore. But get over it. Change happens. A new Britain will come out of this.
Yeah.
The younger generation who didn't grow up in the Britain I grew up in, they grew up in a different Britain. They will find a way. And I'm actually intensely comfortable with a multi-ethnic Britain. I have no problem whatsoever with that. It's as long as basically the massive majority of people share the same basic values, even if they have different faiths, share the same basic loyalty to the state and to each other. And we do not become retreating to ghettos, a new Britain will emerge. And it will be a different Britain, as I've said, but it'll be a functioning Britain. And old gits like me need to get out of it and accept that just because it's not the Britain that I knew, that it's going to be a bad Britain. I mean, my grandfather, who was in the Royal Navy for over 30 years, he was at the very forefront of war. He was sunk 3 times. He was in the Imperial Navy of the early 20th century. My Britain wasn't his Britain.
Yeah.
It's change. It happens. But all I ask of our political class is we manage it properly, because it takes managing. So I'm actually quite optimistic by Yorkshire standards of future Britain, as I am of future Australia.
Do you think, I mean, we're having these discussions now, but there is this notion, that multiculturalism, I mean, I hate the word. I like cosmopolitan. It has more of an upbeat tone to it. But do you think that the problem that we all seem to be facing, and it's a similar kind of dynamic in the United States or dare I say France, there is a lack of proper integrative mechanisms, that the newcomers sometimes pull away from their dominant host community and form their own cluster and speak their own language and don't feel that they are stakeholders in the new country that they've come to. Not all of them will feel like this, to be sure. You're absolutely right. And I don't want to put everyone in the same category. It's a complex, ongoing thing. But every time we see a problem, an ethnic related problem, like we have seen in the UK recently, and we've seen here in Australia as well. Let's not forget. Do you think it's because people don't have that sense of buy-in? And I'm not talking about assimilation. I'm not saying that people from Africa have to be, like white Britons in any way, shape, or form, but they have to feel that they belong. They have to know that if they're next to a white neighbor, that white neighbor will take care of them and their family, as the black neighbor will take care of the white neighbor, if I put it to you crudely. There has to be this social compact between peoples, and if that happens, and if that's what is happening now in today's Britain, fantastic. I don't see it. I don't see it here in Australia. I think we can do a much better job. But again, it really comes down to our political leadership, as you rightly pointed out, as you rightly pointed out earlier. And it also depends on how we see ourselves, because if we lack confidence, Julian, as a society, as a nation state, we lack confidence. Other people come in here, they start second guessing their role in the national project. And then all of a sudden you end up seeing people sloughing off into their own respective groupings, and we end up having intercommunal, interethnic, intersectarian tensions. Where if we had managed it right from the get-go, we would all be sitting in relatively stable, happy societies, right?
Well, I am worried about sectarian politics coming to Britain. I was in Northern Ireland in the 80s, and
Mm.
I saw what sectarian politics, sectarianism could do. But again, the massive majority of our um, hyphen Brits, when I think of Hindus, I think of
Yep.
Sikhs,
Yep.
I think of most Muslims,
Mhm.
perfectly integrated,
Yes.
perfectly integrated. I mean, you don't. They maintain their own identities, but they're also British and very and proudly British. And I have no problem with that. I absolutely, that. In fact, I enjoy that. I would be very happy to. I just don't judge people. I'm a Martin Luther Kingist. I believe in
Yes.
judging people by the the
Content of
content of
their
their
character.
character.
Yes, I
No,
do
I
too.
really, I mean, I passionately believe that. I'm deeply,
Yeah.
because I'm an immigrant myself in the Netherlands,
Yeah.
and
Mm,
I've lived all over the world. I've always been an immigrant.
mm,
I understand this.
mm,
Um, there is a problem with some sectors, particularly, dare I say, in the Muslim community, um, for a whole host of complicated factors that need to be properly managed. Um, Part of which is socioeconomic, about overcoming hopelessness and racism does exist, um, and it's got to be managed. But politicians who, for example, allow thousands of these young, undocumented, mainly men, from war-torn countries to enter our societies, given the threat posed by Islamism, not Islam,
mm,
is that is the failure. It's a failure of policy, not of people, and that's what's driving people mad.
mm.
And they lecture us about with their kumbaya politics worldview, or their wir schaffen das, we can do this nonsense. The simple fact is, when you get these kind of mass migration flows, and they do happen from time to time in history, they do change society, and that change needs managing. But rather, what people are told, that even if they have concerns when they see their towns, their communities, their cities changing before their very eyes, and are told if they criticize it, they're racist, they become angry, they become frustrated. All I'm asking government to do is manage the flows and manage the change, and to promote integration along the lines. You look at the British Muslim Sikh community, much of the British Muslim community, much of the British Hindu, and other communities in the Nigerian, the West African. They're British. I mean, look at people like James Cleverly or Kemi Badenoch. I'm proud that Kemi Badenoch is the leader of the Conservative Party. Not because she's black, because she's a bloody good leader. Um, and that she's black is completely irrelevant to me. She is British, she's impressive, and I think she'd make a great prime minister. Sadly, she won't get the chance, but that's the nature of politics. So again, it all comes back to a failure of elite establishments to properly manage change. And as an immigrant myself in a small Dutch village, albeit liberated by the British, which gives a kind of certain status um, to me here, um, um, it's still, one has to respect that you are in somebody else's community. And whilst I very clearly maintain my British identity, Yorkshire identity, English identity, and they all know that and they understand that, I am deeply respectful of the Dutch culture of which I am now a part.
So Julian, if we have a little bit of fun for the moment, I mean, it's been a very
Yeah,
heavy geopolitical session. But if you were Prime Minister of the UK for one day, what would be your first and only defense reform that you would snap into place?
I would implement the Strategic Defence Review and fully cost it and implement it. I would also invite the financial sector, which Britain has an enormous financial sector, to help fund it by offering very low, long interest loans to ensure that it can be done, which, by the way, is being done by a thing called the Defence Security and Resilience Bank, partly led by my great friend, General Robbie Boyd. That's what I do. We need, if we are to create the space in which we are secure and which change can take place in a managed and effective way, the country must be first and foremost credibly defended, and any potential aggressor must be deterred across cyber, information warfare, and full-on warfare. Now, the irony is, information warfare we Brits are brilliant at. Cyber warfare, quietly, we are very effective at. We will get our high-end warfare capability back in its place, and it will take its rightful place as one of the leaders of NATO, a reformed NATO European pillar over time, and it will deter any adversary and support the United States as long as the United States wishes to be supported in return for having influence over the United States, what the United States does. That's what I would do in my day in office, because 10 hours, 12 hours would give me time to enact all of those instruments.
Excellent, excellent. I'd vote for you. Anyway, look, Julian, we're rapidly running out of time, and you've been very generous with us. I have 3 final questions to give to you. The first one, if we go back to Europe and the European, what Europe needs to do as a collective, if you will. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about European strategic autonomy. There's been a lot of talk about, the transatlantic rift and how the Americans are abandoning NATO and all this kind of stuff. And maybe to a degree, it may all be true, depending on who ends up becoming US president after Trump. I don't know. I mean, there is a thing that we have to all be mindful of, and managing that relationship is going to be very difficult moving forward. But do you think that there is an embryonic European way of warfare that is emerging in Ukraine, which then the European states can look at and say, well, you know what, if we all became a little bit more like Ukraine with the drones and the missiles and all that kind of stuff, that's stuff we can do, that's stuff we can scale up. And if we can forward deploy some of that stuff, all of a sudden Europe becomes looking very, very powerful and very hard to conquer at all on any front, right? What are your thoughts on that? Because, I mean, you did say earlier that European countries, either collectively or individually, cannot become little mini-me's of the United States. It's just not within their bailiwick. But surely looking at what's happening in Ukraine, they can adopt a lot of that and really turn Europe into a powerhouse, can't they?
Well, Ukraine is probably not the best model, despite the lessons from the war being very germane to the future of European defense. Why? Because when the story of Ukraine is finally told, it will be the Americans and the British who were really on the ground doing things quietly in a whole host of things. That's why the Ukrainians are so pro-Brit, because of what we've done behind the scenes, as much as, and other Europeans haven't, frankly, whatever they might say. As to a European way of war, but it won't be, it'll be built around NATO, it'll be collective, it'll be a reformed NATO European pillar, but it won't involve the Brits sending 2 divisions to the continent in the event of war. The Brits will be a maritime amphibious power projection power built around the Joint Expeditionary Force, with a focus on securing the North Atlantic, the Northern Norway, Svalbard, Bear Island, the Greenland, Iceland, UK Cap. That's where Britain will lead. The Germans and the Poles will take responsibility for confronting the Russian army in the east, and the Italians and other southern Europeans will have a more Article 3 striped security focus, looking south, with the Turks focused on what the Turks focus on now, which is the Middle East. So we'll do things differently in that sense. There will be a unifying force built on the current Allied reaction force, which I call the Allied Mobile Heavy Force, which will be like this elite strategic reserve, which will move to support any weakness in our defense. I mean, the Russians, when the story of Ukraine is also again told, it will be a story of immense strategic incompetence by the Russians for invading Ukraine in the first place. Why? Because the Finns are now members of NATO, and no one messes with the Finns, least of all Russians. So we'll do it differently, and we'll focus on our expertise, land, across the multi-domain, air, sea, land, cyber, space, information and knowledge. And we'll organise it in a very European way. Now, what matters is that Britain, France and Germany are in lockstep, because Britain, France and Germany are 70% of all European defence expenditure and over 90% of all European defence industrial research and technology development. That is the reality. It will be built around the big three. Forget common European defence. That's a dangerous pipe dream. It will be a collective European effort, and it will be built on the European political community, which the French created, not the EU, to enable the Brits to be very much part of this. But to enable that, John, to see that happen, the Brits and the French in particular have to stop taking chunks out of each other, which is all too. It's satisfying for the Brits and the French to be taking chunks out of each other. We've done it for centuries, even though it's stupid. We need each other as well, so that needs to happen. So it'll come. It won't be the American way of war, but it'll be a European way of war, or rather a European way of deterrence, defence and peace.
Okay, next question would have to be about Russia. There's been a lot of talk that Vladimir Putin doesn't look as secure as he once did. I mean, gosh, his hometown, was struck. St. Petersburg was struck with by Ukrainian missiles. And at the time, there was some sort of international conference going on. So in view of all the conference goers, there was a pall of black smoke coming up from St. Petersburg, Putin's hometown. How vulnerable do you think Vladimir Putin is? And by the way, there's one other thing that just to tack onto that. What do you think has led to such obvious incompetence with regard to the Russian high command, the Russian army generally? I know when we had General Ben Hodges on with us earlier in the year, I asked him the question, if Stalin and his system of brutality can still produce the likes of a Zhukov, where is Putin's Zhukov? Putin is, and I'm being generous here, Stalin light, and emphasis on the light. You would think that with that modicum of freedom of movement and lovely lifestyle that the modern Russian would have in the elite circle, that the cream would rise to the top. But there doesn't seem to be much cream in the Russian military system. Ben was at a bit of a he said, well, it's a good question. And so, from a historic perspective, and drawing on your history, your knowledge of European history, what do you think accounts for Russia's incapacities rather than its capacities? And by the way, don't forget, is Putin vulnerable?
And first of all, Stalin's Russia, Soviet Union, wasn't as brilliant as it's often portrayed in World War II. A large number of the huge casualties they suffered were because of the incompetence of their leadership, not least Zhukov and Konev. They like to play I've been to Moscow, I've been taken to the War Museum, I've been taken to the Victory Park, and I've been shown all this. And it's almost like massive death is a mark of greatness. Whereas, in fact, a lot of Russians died unnecessarily by just being launched at the Wehrmacht, swamping them in numbers. So, Zhukov and Konev and other senior Russian commanders who Stalin had in competition with each other, various army groups, probably overstated, given the sacrifice of the Russian people, which was immense. The sacrifice of ordinary Russians. Now that's important because ordinary Russians are used to sacrificing.
Yeah.
They're not weak Western liberals like we are. Suffering is part of the Russian condition. Now, Putin's problem and our problem is he's not only to some extent vulnerable to some kind of putsch from within the Siloviki, he's also old. And there's no succession plan in place. And when I look at some of the people around Putin, particularly people like Patrushev the Younger, who could be a potential successor, they frighten the hell out of me. They make Putin look like a moderate. And there's a big danger that if the war leads to Putin's fall, and frankly it should, we have a highly unstable succession in a state with more nuclear weapons than any other, built on this anti-fascist stroke, we in the West are fascist, false premise, in which the Russian people again suffer. And my God, have they suffered and are again suffering. Putin's power base and the power base of many of the clique in the Kremlin is not Moscow or St. Petersburg. By the way, they've been protected from much of the service in Ukraine. It's the Russian countryside. It's rural Russia. It's traditional Russia, the Russia that believes in the strong man, that believes Putin is the embodiment of Russia, as Putin himself believes he is the embodiment of Russia, who believe in the threat posed by the West. At some point, the Russians will also realize the extent to which the Chinese have them under their thumb and the humiliation that's implicit in the selling out of Russia to China by Putin, which will also lead to trouble. We are going to have trouble with Russia in whatever form it takes going forward, because Russia is a disaster waiting to happen. And that's the issue that we should be preparing for, with a very, very clear-eyed view of where Russia is at today and where it's going.
You know, I hate to use this comparison, but I will just for the sake of argument. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, it was a juggernaut, and it was an empire that imploded from within. And the Soviet Union had lots of nuclear weapons and all kinds of things. It still had a functional military structure, I suppose. Why do we think the worst possible outcome will happen as a consequence of the removal of Putin by natural or foul means, when the Soviet Union, a much bigger, scarier actor on the international stage, when it collapsed, you know, life went on, there was turmoil, you know, the Soviet Union was no more, but Russia took its place and all the other little republics around it. Yes, chaos, but there was no great, horrible, impending threat that came as a consequence of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, if we play the counterfactual, one could say, well, John, you know, had it not been for X or Y or this or that, you know, the whole world would have been incinerated by, you know, as a consequence of the collapse. But we didn't see it then. So what makes you think we'll see it with the demise of Putin?
Three factors. One, there is no Gorbachev. Gorbachev, Perestroika, Glasnost, from 1985 onwards, you know, he led the Soviet Union in the belief that it couldn't survive, that it was bound to collapse. He tried to reform it in the hope it wouldn't, but he was open to the West. Second, the West was open to him. The meetings with Thatcher and Reagan, with Kohl, the West were willing to offer the Russians a soft landing, which gave the Russians some hope that they'd be integrated into the West, that their elites would make money. Then you had Yeltsin, chaos, oligarchs, rip-offs, from which the Russian people gained nothing. And then after this great kleptocracy had stolen from the Russian people, in came Putin on a narrative that the West had betrayed the Russians, that the West had promised it would do X, Y, and Z, it would help Russia, blah, 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 and they'd once again betrayed the West. None of that exists right now. You have a clique around Putin who are ultra-nationalist. There's very little civil society. There's no alternative forces or voices which were allowed by Gorbachev in the final years from 85 to 89, 90. And there is still this Russian capacity for self-pity. It's never the fault of Russia. Russia is always being betrayed. Russia is always, whatever's happened to Russia is the fault of the West and fascists and all that. This narrative in which they're trapped worries the hell out of me. We got away with it at the end of the Cold War. There's no guarantee we'll get away with it again.
You don't think that we would have our own survival at stake and offer a post-Putin Russia a soft landing? You think that we're hard-nosed enough now because of the Ukraine war that we'll just tell any new Russian leadership to go take a flying leap?
No, we'll try. We'll try and give them that soft landing again. But there's no guarantee that they'll take it.
Yeah.
Because they'll say, you're trying to trick us again. You're going to betray us again.
Right.
So, whatever the situation, it's going to be a very uncertain and dangerous situation. Of course, we'll try to kind of, again, engineer a peace. But there's no guarantee, one, that they will agree to it, and two, that we have the quality of leadership that would engineer it.
It all comes down to the leadership in the end, right?
Look back in 1989, Bush Senior, Kohl, Mitterrand, Thatcher. These were big figures, and they knew their history. They'd all been in World War II. They knew what they were dealing with. The current crop of numpties that tend to lead us don't have the same weight.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so finally, Julian, what is the one strategic reality policymakers understand least well today?
The one strategic policy reality that leaders fail to understand today, that war is possible. That, as Plato said, only the dead have seen the last of war. Many of our leaders live in a fantasy that war has been banished to history. It hasn't. Everything I look at as a historian, as a strategist, as an analyst, tells me that there's a chance of war today as much as there was in the past. I was watching the D-Day celebrations this week on 6th of June. They were interviewing one of the few remaining British veterans. Yeah. And he was remembering his mates on the beaches who died. And for him, they were people. They were guys. They weren't headstones. They were, his mates. Yeah. And he was heartbroken to be there to remember them. He said, the greatest sadness of all is we seem to be warming up for another one.
Julian, honestly, a somber note to finish off on, but I really greatly appreciate your time that you spent with us.
Pleasure,
and we must do it again. Professor Julian Lindley-French, it's been an absolute pleasure. One of the things I take away from this conversation is that military power cannot be separated from political will, and political will cannot be separated from confidence. Whether we're talking about Britain, Europe, NATO, Ukraine, or the wider West, the question may no longer be whether we understand the threats we face. The question is whether we still possess the confidence and determination to respond to them. And now on to questions for our audience. Is the United Kingdom's defence problem primarily financial, or has it become political and cultural? Is Europe's biggest challenge Russia, or Europe's own lack of confidence and strategic direction? Are we entering a period of Western renewal or Western decline? Let us know in the comments section below. My thanks to the producers of Focus, Neil Smart and Lynn Sear, and to our audience, thanks for being part of the conversation. I'm John Bruni. Stay informed, stay engaged, and stay focused.